Hello, good evening.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How you doing?
I'm well. I'm well. You know, they say
Fantastic.
with Murphy's Law, everything that can go wrong will go wrong.
But we made it in the end, that's what matters.
Very
Yeah.
true. Good to be here.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming on to Offline Almost Review. Ladies and
Mm.
gentlemen, we have His Royal Excellency, if I can use that, His Excellency Chad Blackman, the Ambassador for Barbados to the United Nations and World Trade Organization, and is also the chair for the World Trade Organization's Environment
And trade
and
committee, yes.
yeah, the titles are so many, but I
No
try my
worries.
best. I'll leave you to introduce yourself in case I haven't done justice enough, please.
No, that's fine. But once again, thank you for allowing me to be on your show. I do follow it from time to time. The content of what you've been discussing is very, very important. As you would have said, I am Barbados's ambassador to the United Nations and the World Trade Organizations here in Geneva. I'm also the chair of the Trade and Environment Committee in the WTO, and before I was the chair of the Trade and Development Committee. I'm also a UN gender champion, so I champion a lot of the issues relative to gender. Uh,
Mm.
yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. There's a lot more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. It's a privilege and an honor to have you here. We just, Offline Upwards Review is a platform where we sort of share inspirational, informative, and educative content for viewers all around the world, and how we can make ourselves better, and for us to seek information and knowledge and understand what we can bring onto the human race. If you can please just sort of start with telling us about your background, please, your education
Sure,
and
that's
how you
fine.
got involved in all this. Yeah.
Well, for a number of years in my previous life, I was involved in international development for a number of time. I worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. I would have been my country's youth ambassador to CARICOM. I would have been a consultant from different times in areas of trade, legal consultant, and also issues relative to data protection law. So it's quite a varied background, but all of that really has brought me here to Geneva, and I've been able to bring all of that experience in the different spheres that I've been in into my role.
Oh, fantastic. So tell us, what exactly happens at the United Nations? Because when people hear the United Nations, you know, things start popping up. People don't understand. People just think, it's a place where a lot of things happen that people don't know. It's a place where things happen that people know. What is the United Nations, and what is your role as an ambassador to the United Nations?
Well, first, let me put it into context. The UN is a very large international organization comprising of governments, really. And
Okay.
in Geneva, as you said, I'm the ambassador here, but there's also the UN headquarters in New York. But the second largest UN body, as it were, is in Geneva. And interestingly enough, the global hub for diplomacy is here in Geneva. So there's the United Nations as an institution here, but there are also a number of UN institutions as well in Geneva. So, for example, you have the World Trade Organization, as you mentioned, the World Health Organization, organizations relative to human rights, refugees, World Intellectual Property Organization. What you can think of a global organization that deals with many broad issues, it's based here. So I am Barbados's chief diplomat to these institutions. And what that invariably means is that I represent my country's interests in the organizations, and the discussions that take place in the organizations, I also transmit back to my country. So when there are negotiations in the international community on behalf of the country and the government, I am the chief person who does that with the support of my staff here.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So what sort of interest will you be protecting in terms for Barbados? Um, the- you know, I know for a fact that you'll be talking things like trade,
Yeah.
um, Do you deal with economical terms, with politics, and every other thing that it comes with?
It's really all the above. Any interest you can think of, invariably is here. So as I mentioned, you have the World Trade Organization. So I represent Barbados's interests in trade, and what that looks like sometimes would reflect things of how do you shape the rules that countries engage in ensuring that your private sector back home or the ordinary business person who wants to export their goods or services across borders can operate. And that's the role, for example, of trade. In terms of the World Health Organization, similarly, particularly now in the age of COVID-19 and before, there are a number of international standards in health that countries sign up to, that you continue to lobby on behalf of your country. And you also ensure that your country is in a position to raise any issues of capacity constraints in executing those deliverables that we've all agreed to, and a number of other areas. Issues also of intellectual property. The World Intellectual Property Organization is based here in Geneva. So there is a wide array of interests that the country, not just Barbados, a number of countries in the world are here to have advanced in. Absolutely. Very, very, very important. Very important.
Okay. So if, in terms of the economical factors, because I know for a fact that there's been a lot, for instance, I'll use, let's say Barbados is coming onto the table. And then you have countries like maybe the UK, maybe the US or Sweden or France. There's been a general consensus that there's certain Western countries that are able to get better deals than the likes of maybe Jamaica, Barbados, Africa. Why is that? Because, I studied business economics at the university, and I was told that a lot of countries that come, especially if I can use the word developing countries, when they go and lobby for trade or they want to export their goods, they usually do not get a good deal. For instance, I'll give you an instance. Say a country is, from Africa is given, they want to get a loan. And then they say to them, when you get this loan, for you to be able to pay back, maybe to the IMF or the World Trade Organization, when you get paying back this, for you to be able to pay back this loan, you have to reduce your infrastructure, your health spending, your education, and so on and so forth. Is that true? And why is that, if it is true?
Well, let me put it in context for you. Part of the issue that not just small island states like Barbados, but countries in the developing world face, and it's an issue that Barbados has raised and continues to raise, is that in the multilateral system, there's a lot of capacity constraints that we have in terms of our ability to lobby to ensure that we get what we need or what we want based on our resources. That's the first rule of thumb. The second rule of thumb is that we have to, let me put it this way. We've often approached these things before. Now it has changed a lot on a national basis only. And we approach these things in negotiations from a singular basis. What you would see is that when you approach it as a regional group, for example, on the basis of CARICOM or as the African Union, there's more ability for leverage to have your interests advanced. Now, in terms of the truth of the whole issue of debt and the borrowing of loans, you've raised a very critical point, one that's at the heart of Barbados' foreign policy at this point in time, where we've continued to say to the international community, countries like Barbados, with a very small population, roughly 290,000 to 300,000 people, a small landmass, notwithstanding that the country has done well economically, there's almost a penalization for that. Now, what do I mean by that? Barbados and similarly a number of countries in the Caribbean are classified as high-income countries by the World Bank. And therefore, because you are classified by being high-income, which is variably how much money your country is able to produce divided by your population.
Is that like GDP?
GDP per capita, precisely.
Okay.
On that basis, countries like Barbados are precluded from having a number of international concessions and a number of international loans, purely on the basis of that criteria alone. Now, when you compare that to a number of other countries who have way larger populations, way larger resources at their disposal, But when you divide their population by their wealth, they come up as low income, and they're more endowed resource-wise than, for example, a Barbados. But yet, in a circumstance where, Lord forbid, we were hit by a hurricane and we need to go to the international market or the international community for assistance, then they say, well, you know, Barbados has the capacity to have their issues treated on their own. No, surely that cannot be the way. And it's something that we have said throughout here in the United Nations, both in Geneva and UNCTAD, which is the organization in the UN system that deals with trade and development, but also further afield. And our Prime Minister has made it particularly clear that this criteria has to change. It has to be just and it has to be fair, because vulnerability is at the core of our reality. Now let's put this into context. COVID-19 has and continues to affect us all. Large countries, small countries, landlocked countries, coastal states, it doesn't matter. And it has really ripped the Band-Aid off and exposed.
Oh, your network is breaking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now, yes. Good.
Notwithstanding that COVID-19 was taking place, there were a number of countries in between March and April who were affected by the ravages of climate change. Climate change for us is a reality. In the Caribbean, we're into the month of June, as you know. So in the months of June, July, August, we are anticipating a very active hurricane season. And God forbid that, notwithstanding the impact that our economies have had to endure over the last couple of months, should we be affected by another natural disaster in the Caribbean, then can you imagine the ramifications that this will have on our economies, our people, our infrastructure, our quality of life, issues relative to food. So you see, therefore, you just can't look at a country's per capita income alone as a basis on their ability to have great capacity. So that's something that we've been saying for a very long time, and we've said it to the point where that it is now deeply embedded in the country's foreign policy.
Okay, so what you're saying in a nutshell is that the means by which countries are tested, or how can I put it? The means by which countries are being is it evaluated in terms of what they can produce for themselves or the kind of help they can get is not fair enough.
No, it is not.
Okay.
It is not. It is not. And that's why there has been a clarion call by countries, particularly Barbados and other small and developing states, that there has to be for example, our Prime Minister has called for it, a vulnerability index, where you measure a country's capacity and the constraints and circumstances peculiar to those countries that ought to be then now put into the mainstream matrix of the UN system and the world multilateral system, not just in the UN, but across the board. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So in terms of how long has this been going on now? When you want to make this kind of change, do you need to like vote about it, or do you need to just bring it onto the agenda?
I'm glad you asked that. It's done by consensus. That's the beautiful thing, or it depends on how you look at it, but that's one of the hallmarks of the multilateral system. So for example, in the World Trade Organization, if you have a proposal, whether you're large or small, it doesn't matter. Every decision, every rule, every regulation is done by consensus. So what that invariably means is that every country has to agree to whatever is being proposed. And if let's say you have 194 countries and 193 countries agree, but there's one country that says, no, I don't want to agree to that proposal, then the proposal wouldn't go ahead. That's the model. So in order to achieve what you want in that sort of model, it makes it a bit more difficult. Now, the benefit of that is that because countries are small and some countries are large, some countries have different resources, the reason why the consensus model was implemented is so that everyone would have a fair share of having the opportunity of having their proposals and interests met. Because if you do voting, it wouldn't necessarily be the same. So it has its pros and it has its cons.
Okay. So say, for instance, if the whole of Europe wants something, they want a proposal, and countries in the Caribbean or countries from Africa go against it. So how do you how is there a fair, platform to actually know that, okay, countries don't gang up against each other, if I can use that word. And if that happens, what are the measures in place to counter that sort of happening?
Well, it goes back to what I just said. Because of the consensus-based model, for example, the World Trade Organization,
Yeah.
that model protects small countries from being rolled over, as it were. But it really comes back to the whole aspect of what diplomats do, negotiate. Negotiation is at the heart of the skill set before countries. And therefore, you have lots of different meetings and engagements with countries, large and small, large clusters, small clusters, so that you advance your country's interests. And one of the things that you do is that you try to meet halfway where possible and show other countries areas of common cause on where you can show them the interest that we both have together. So, for example, there was this myth, and in many pockets there still is, that climate change is only an issue that affects small states or island states, and that's not true. There are a number of countries, for example, in Europe, both in continental Europe, who are affected by climate change. Now, they may be affected differently because, for example, in the Caribbean region or in the Pacific region, they're affected by typhoons and hurricanes. But there are a number of diseases, for example, droughts, that are affecting a number of countries. So when you approach it from that basis, yes, I may have a different manifestation of the issue taking place to yours, but we face the same issue. Then you then start to bring people together and then ask the question, okay, now that we've got past the first hurdle of realizing that we both have an issue together, then what's the next step? How can we then treat to this? And so these are some of the things that you have to undertake in this sort of reality. But to get back to your point, or your more substantive point, smaller countries have to work quite hard to ensure that their interest is advanced. But it doesn't mean that you don't get your interest advanced. But you have to work hard. You have to ensure that you negotiate in good faith. You have to ensure that you're always following what's going on in the international arena. And it should be put on the table as well. Smaller countries have smaller missions. So what does that mean? A country might have, as a diplomatic mission, a small country might have a staff of 10, covering every institution in Geneva. Whereas a larger country, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of resources, may have sometimes 100 staff dealing with the same thing. So the staff, the mission with the staff of 10 is expected to give the same deliverables and objectives as the staff of the mission with the staff of, let's say, 100. Now, that forces a serious level of creativity on the smaller missions and smaller jurisdictions in the countries, because you still have to ensure that your interests are realized. So I can give you an example. There were many times that I've literally left the UN. I started at 9, for example, and then I had to rush from the UN dealing with a human rights issue and head across Geneva, further across Geneva, to the World Trade Organization to deal with a trade issue. And then halfway in that meeting, I then had to leave and go to WIPO to deal with an intellectual property issue, all on the same day, completely different topics. Whereas some of the missions have at least 2 or 3 ambassadors and a lot of support staff as diplomats under them to be able to cover these things. So it calls for a serious level of creativity. But it has to be done, because at the end of the day, your country's interest and the interest of all of the people in your country depend heavily on what you're doing here.
So with your role, is what's the time like? The time for the...
Yeah, that's fair enough. Normally, ambassadors are appointed for 2 or 4 years. It depends. Some countries do it for 2. Some countries do it for 4. It depends on each state. Each state can determine how long they normally want their ambassadors to go.
Okay, fantastic. In terms of what Barbados is looking to achieve on a global scale, what are the immediate, medium, and the long-term goals and aims of the message or the image that you're trying to proclaim to the world? Because I've had a lot of good things about Barbados. I've heard about the carnival. I know that's where Rihanna comes from. That's what most people. That's what most people used to. That's the connecting factor for a lot of people like myself. And one of these days, I'm looking forward to visiting Barbados. But what would you like to say to people for them to actually understand what Barbados is all about?
True, you're right. Barbados has an excellent offering in terms of its culture. Fantastic jurisdiction in terms of its beaches, infrastructure, but also it's more than just a destination for sun, sea, and sand. It's a very serious jurisdiction for business, and we have a lot of very sound economic policies that allows for foreign investors to come and domicile in Barbados. And that is one of the hallmarks of the country. And when you combine the country's business infrastructure and its quality of life, it then makes it a new place for people to come live, work, and play, as we've said before. But in terms of moving forward, one of the focuses for us in the short term, obviously, is to stabilize Barbados now in the advent of COVID-19, but also to build an economy that allows for young people in Barbados to use their talents and skills in a way that they have never done before. There is a mantra to ensure that we don't only place our country's prosperity in the under the auspices of tourism only, because as you can see, COVID-19 has really shown that tourism, notwithstanding that it's fantastic, it is not necessarily always going to be in the same reality. So we're looking to ensure that we have different areas of growth. But Barbados, I can tell you, because of our educational system and the high per capita basis of our citizens being engaged in tertiary education, it therefore means that Barbados has a lot to offer the world in terms of its intellectual capacity. And that is one of our huge exports. And one of the mantras of the government now is to ensure that Barbados becomes one of the most, if not the most efficient country in the world. And by that, technology will play a critical role in ensuring that we can, one, offer a higher quality of life for our children, our students, our business community, but also for persons when they come to Barbados, that they can do business in a way that is seamless, in a way that they're accustomed to abroad. But equally, for us, it's more than just accommodating the interests of those coming from abroad. It's about saying that we have a global vision as a small state, and that we want to make that impact on the world through our way of life. And that's why in a number of different international forums, you would hear the voice of Barbados speaking on issues from a broad range of perspectives. And that is really the hallmark of the country. Now, in terms of international business, as I said, Barbados has one of the lowest OECD compliant tax rates in the world. What that allows for companies to do is to relocate to Barbados in a way that they can ensure that they prosper their business, whilst at the same time being in an environment that is not one where you have to wonder if these regulations are going against international regimes, for example, economic regimes. So Barbados is well poised, and also it's also a country that's geographically poised in a very good place. So from a international transport perspective, Barbados invariably serves as a hub throughout the region in terms of connection. We have daily connections before COVID-19 from London, Gatwick, London Heathrow, Manchester. Then we also have from Miami, New York, Toronto, Panama in Central America, and also in South America. So you see, therefore, Barbados is more than just an island. It's more than just a place for good fun. It's a place where you can really make your mark as a country. Do we have our challenges? Absolutely. But when you look at it, I wouldn't recommend any other place else in the world for a person to live and to play.
Of course.
And I say that sincerely. No, I'm not being diplomatic about it. I'm really serious.
Yeah. What are the tax benefits for companies or for people wanting to relocate or wanting to go and establish something in Barbados?
Well, as I said, good question. As I said, Barbados is pretty much a low tax jurisdiction, but it is a low tax jurisdiction that's compliant with, for example, the OECD. We're not a jurisdiction where people can brand this as a tax haven at all. Okay? So when you relocate there, the good thing about Barbados is that when you relocate to Barbados as a company, you don't necessarily have to bring your workforce with you, because you have a high level of Barbadians who are educated at, for example, the degree level, who can offer you your services. So whether that be lawyers, accountants, doctors, but also further afield. The quality of life that as an investor you will enjoy is pretty high because we have a lot of businesses and young persons who start businesses in areas, for example, that would cater to your lifestyle. So excellent spas, excellent resorts, and that sort of attraction is there. And the government is currently and constantly reviewing its policies to ensure that when foreign investors come, they get the true Barbadian experience, but they also get a global experience in allowing their businesses to thrive, and therefore, serves as the ideal place for doing business.
Okay, fantastic. What is the connection between Barbados, Europe, and Africa? I'm particularly interested in the African aspect of things because over the years, I think it's only about within the last 5-10 years now that the Caribbean islands have a deep connection with African countries because of the music and tourism. But I feel in a way that we haven't sort of explored that opportunity well enough, because when you look at Africa and when you look at a country like Barbados, there's a lot of, if I can use the word connectivity around there, and there's a lot of synergy that can happen. How are you looking to sort of take advantage of this opportunity? Because I know for a fact countries like Jamaica are trying that out right now. They haven't gone fully into it, but I know from what I see and from what I read from my contact and the connection that I have, I know that Barbados also has a strong hold in terms of the tourism aspect, in terms of hospitality that it can offer to the world, Africans especially, because not so many Africans go to Barbados and not so many people from Barbados go to Africa.
Yes, in the inverse. Well, I can tell you this. Part of the government strategy within the last 2 years of assuming office has been to come to the full understanding that Africa, we have a historical connection naturally, of course, as we can tell, with the continent. And the time has come, some may say long past, but the time has now come to deepen that relationship between Barbados and Africa. And one of the things that the government has done within the last year and a half is for a number of African countries, the government has waived visas to Barbados. So, if you go online now, you will see that a high number of African countries can literally go to Barbados for holiday, holiday period, usually about 60 to 90 days without a visa. And that has been part of the understanding of the government that we have to deepen our ties with the continent. And it's not just for tourism, it's also for business. As you are well aware, Africa is the fastest growing region globally. And for us in the Caribbean as well, we have a lot of skills that we can offer in terms of business there. And we also think that Africa has a number of partnerships that we can have in Barbados, for example, in the Caribbean. So it's that sort of understanding. And you are also rightly said, the culture is rich. Barbados is the home of something called spooge. You probably never heard of spooge. Okay. But after this video, I'll send it to you so you can hear what spooge music is. But it was originated in Barbados. There are a number of cultural things that we have that we can export to the world and modify it and fuse it. I bet you if I ask you, do you know where the grapefruit was invented? Which country would you tell me?
Well, now that you're asking, I'll say Barbados, but I never knew that.
There you go. Absolutely. The grapefruit. If you're going to Tesco's in the UK or if you're going to anywhere in the United States or anywhere in the world and you see a grapefruit, the concept is a Barbadian concept. It was grafted in Barbados, all right, by a Barbadian called John Redmond Bevell. And I could also say to you that any rum that you taste in the world, even though it may not be from Barbados, the particular rum, the concept of rum is Barbadian. We invented rum, okay? 1703. So the point I'm making is there are a lot of historical things that we have that we need to export even more, even though we're exporting. Coming now to Africa on a diplomatic level, our government is also, we're looking to establish diplomatic missions in the continent. So for example, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, and then as we will roll out more. But Barbados is particularly serious in doing that. Last year, Prime Minister Motley and our foreign minister and a delegation went to Ghana during its year of the return. So for us,
I
it's
was
more than
there.
just yes, absolutely, and by all indications, it was a success. So for us, it's more than just tourism. That's part of it, because when you open your borders to tourists and you have that symbiotic movement, then you start to engage in cultural exposing of each other. But can you imagine the possibility of having a young Barbadian calypso or soca artist, or bashment soca artist as they call them now, fusing with Afro beats? Okay, where
Fantastic.
absolutely, and in the age of technology, you don't literally have to fly anymore to a place to record in a studio. I can stay, for example, in Barbados, upload my aspect of the track and fuse it with yours in another studio, and then you master that, and then you have music. But the point is that there is a huge potential for cross-pollination of our cultures, and that is what has to happen. For business as well, we have to be doing the same thing. And this brings me to a broader point, that South-South cooperation is more important now than ever. Historically, yes, we've looked north, and not just in the Caribbean, most countries in the developing world. But there is a huge untapped global market in the developing world that we have to tap into. And once we can get our business persons, our young persons, our entrepreneurs, our women, because, and I mentioned women particularly, in terms of trade, the global economy, if all women were to participate in the global economy in terms of trade, you can have another economy, for example, like the size of the United States, contributing into the global economic system. That's the potential that women in trade have. And that's why we have to empower our young women to be highly involved in commerce, in international business, in exports, building their capacity. The days of women being on the margins of economic activity ought to stop. And Barbados believes in that quite firmly. So the point I'm making, back to the Africa-Caribbean linkage, there is a huge potential that we can tap into between our two regions.
Okay, that's brilliant. I mean, in terms of like Afro beats and soca and all that, this is something that we can actually make happen. So I'll be
Absolutely.
referring to
I
some
mean,
of the
sometimes
artists.
when I'm writing a speech or I'm doing research, you
Yeah.
probably wouldn't guess who I'm listening to in my headphones. Burna Boy.
Okay, the
Yeah.
African giant.
Mhm. African
Yeah.
Giant, Burna Boy. Sometimes it depends on my mood. Davido, Wizkid, it depends. But the point is, if we can get our Caribbean people more exposed to the African music,
Yes.
then you start to, there's something in our brains that allows for us to then merge and fuse our cultures, our music, or genres. And this is the sort of economic activity that we can all have.
Okay, that's a fair point. So in terms of language, what's the major language in Barbados?
Right. So the official language is English,
Yes.
but we have a local variation we call Bajan, Bajan. Yeah,
Let me write that.
it's English. Yeah, Bajan,
Bajan. Okay.
Bajan, Bajan, and
Okay.
colloquially we also call Bajans as well. So officially we are Barbadians. You see that on a passport or an official document. But even on some international currency exchanges, you will see the Bajan dollar or the Barbados dollar. So it depends on the context.
Okay. Fantastic. I'm learning a lot today. So
Good.
I mean, it will be a really, really good thing when this synergy starts happening. And I believe you're on top of all that. So we would like to see that happening as soon as possible in the nearest future, so that we can start to take advantage of all these great opportunities. What is the main sorts of, if I can say, services? For some countries, the mainstay of income generation can be from like services, or from manufacturing, or agriculture. What's the main source of income for Barbados?
Yeah. So tourism. Tourism is our number one business. Our number two sector then would be international business, where we have a number of companies investing in Barbados and setting up and being domiciled and operating there. But again, as I said, this pandemic, and before we've known this as well, but this pandemic has really shown that there is an urgent need for diversification of the economy. Because as I said, and as you can see, across the world, tourism has pretty much stopped. There are no planes, and we're an island. We're not on the continent with another country. So in order for persons to get to our country, they have to fly.
Yeah, fly.
So without that, then you then start to see the impact economically that has start to have in our country. But that's why, as I said, culture and our way of life is a very untapped resource. But then the question is, how do you commoditize the culture, the way you live, the way you talk, the way you dance, the way you dress, and make that into a global supply of a demand out there? When you look at what has happened historically, for example, in the United States, the reason why the United States' cultural brand is so strong is that in the 50s, 60s, they used systematically the television and media to be the mouthpiece of its culture, the expression of that culture. And what then happened is that persons across the world on television saw a way of life that through subliminal strategies allowed for you to then market it and exactly want you to want that quality of life. And what was attached to that quality of life? Certain goods and services that you then had to import from that jurisdiction. So it's the same sort of thing. I mean, you can retweak it, but it's a model that has been proven and is proven. We have to use social media, technology, television to market our way of life in a way that the world wants and can consume. But we have to protect that via intellectual property as well, okay? And that's what we have to start getting our populations to thinking, how do I protect my intellectual resource? Because historically, sometimes there has been a doubt by many countries and the people in the countries that what they have to offer the world is not something that they may want, and that's not true. And many times we wait until a foreign investor or someone outside of our jurisdiction comes, commoditizes it, and protects it under international intellectual property. Then we realize, oh, I should have done something. No, we have to see value in ourselves. And then once you start to see value in yourself and value in what you have to offer, then the export potential is huge. But that's why international trade law is so important. Many people see international trade law as just a very remote and static thing. But international trade law and international trade policy really serves as a protection or a facilitator for your country to export and engage in international trade. That's really what it is.
Okay. So, so in a way, you know, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, even though they're separate, but they go hand in hand, because by protecting one entity, you have to work with the other one.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've hit the nail on the head. They're different institutions, but they all serve as part of the global ecosystem to advance countries' interests in development and trade, economics, and security. Yeah.
So who, even though they work hand in hand, who has authority over the other? Which entity has authority over the other? If I can use that.
So they operate not in a authority over the other. The most global international organization, as it were, is the UN. But the other institutions are UN organizations. So the United Nations is like the core, but then there are different branches of that core. So the World Trade Organization is a UN institution, but it's called the World Trade Organization. It has its own Director General. Similarly, WIPO, similarly, the World Health Organization. But they're part of the UN system. So the UN is a very global institution in every aspect that you can think of. So there's no superseding, as it were, but, and a big but, the UN is headed by the Secretary General of the United Nations. But people must be aware that the international organizations are organizations that invariably belong to the governments. So the international institutions work for the governments. Okay? So it's like one big international civil service. That's the best way that I can put that.
It's like what? So, say that again. One big.
No, I'm saying, so it's like look, the best way to look at it is it's like one big global civil service working on behalf of the people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as nations, you know, as nations and as individuals, let me use the word as individuals, how can we, even though we're from different parts of the world, how can we begin to have more impact on how decisions are taken at the highest level at the UN and at the World Trade Organization. Because when we say these words, when people hear United Nations or World Trade Organization, it's, I mean, they're normal words that have normal meanings, but people sort of think, you know what, there's a hierarchy of people that can deal with the United Nations or World Trade Organization. But, you know, I believe people should be able to understand how they can make an impact, even though they're not the ambassadors, like yourself now. People that are in Barbados, how can they have reach and access to you for them to be able to explain their needs or their wants or the kind of ideas they have? How is that possible?
Right. So you are right in terms of there is a systematic approach. I don't like to use the term hierarchy, but there is a demarcation between roles and access. But broadly speaking, if persons have interests or queries or anything that they want to have advanced or quick query, for example, in each country, you go to your representatives, whatever form that may be. But equally, outside of going to representatives, in the age of social media, the age of almost like a modern type of informal democracy, that's why I like to call social media, really.
Informal.
We now have really, I mean, it's not binding, but it provides a platform and a voice. People continue to do that. They raise their voice on critical issues that are critical to them, and that must continue. Now, there has to be a balance, because I believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And with rights come responsibilities. So though people have a right to express themselves and to query things, it must be done in accordance with the law, and it must be done in accordance with what's just. Once you can find that balance, really, that's what's important. But I completely support that. People have the right to ask their representatives what they're doing on their behalf. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, since I came here, I would have set up an online platform via Facebook, Instagram, so that people in my country, for example, can see what I'm doing on their behalf. Because yes, you know, I'm the ambassador, but I'm the ambassador of who? Of Barbados, which therefore means I'm accountable to the people back home. And that's the way I see it. That's the way I see it. And it's really also followed by a model of our Prime Minister. Since she's become Prime Minister, all of her public engagements, speeches, they're online, because she's acting not in her name, but she's acting on behalf of our people. And that one has been one of the hallmarks of this new administration in providing transparency to our people. People need to know what you're doing on their behalf. So to get back to the point or the question that you've asked, I think that's something that more countries ought to do. You have to have constant engagement. And there will be times that it won't be tough. Sometimes the public will ask you tough questions in terms of your governance. But you know, you're working on their behalf, and I really must give credit to Barbados as a country for really taking that on board and doing that, and other countries really should follow.
Okay, thank you for answering that. Even though I mean, I believe we've come a long way as Africans and as Black people, and we're representing our countries, we're trying to look. I believe there's more we can do, because I believe as a people, I mean, Black people and Africans in general, we're still not represented well enough, or we don't represent ourselves well enough. We don't tell our stories. What sort of things do you have in place to make sure that a country like Barbados is heard, even though you're the UN? What are the things you do that are out of the box, if I can use that way, that is different? And you know, that's been able to make you stand out among your colleagues, because we live and learn every day.
No, true. Let me say this to the question of how has Barbados been able to stand out. I'll give you a very real example. First, let me start from the top. Our Prime Minister Motley, has at every opportunity that she's been given or taken, really, pushed our country's message, our country's interests, without fear, without fervor, based on fact, based on research, and based on ensuring that people understand what the country has to offer and what the country stands for. Now, that may not be very popular in some quarters sometimes, but that's what you have to do. As a state, you have under international law the protection as a state, a sovereign state, to determine your country's destiny. And I always say sometimes to colleagues, or remind them rather, that Barbados' foreign policy is determined in Bridgetown, nowhere else. So though you may be large, though you may be small, your interests ought to be protected. That's the first thing. Since I've come here, for example, in Geneva, I've always sought to ensure that Barbados gets the best level of representation that I can bring as humanly possible. And in a short period of time, I've been able to push our country's narrative, push our country's interests, and to do it in a way that is not necessarily what people would think of a small state. And I'll give you another example of this. I was speaking to a colleague about just before COVID-19 really took off. And they said, you know, when you listen to you speak, and when you listen to your Prime Minister speak and the other Barbadian ambassadors around the world, you would think that Barbados is the size of Australia. And I smiled. And I said, why did you say that? He said, no, really, the projection that Barbados gives is that it's a big, powerful, wealthy state. Now, we're not big geographically. We're not wealthy by comparison to other states. We have no military might. But Barbados has the wealth and power of integrity and speaking on a very clear conscience as an international member of the community. So when you have that confidence as a small state, you literally, you take that in stride and you push and you advance. Now, I would have spoken before about UNCTAD. Now, in the United Nations system, UNCTAD is the organization, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that covers all issues of trade and development. So WTO focuses on trade regulations, fine, but UNCTAD serves as the organization that focuses on trade and development. And every 4 years, that organization holds a major global conference where you attract about 5,000 or 6,000 people in the course of a week in your jurisdiction. A small country has never held it before. And when I came here in 2018, so last year, 2019, with the support of my government, of course, I lobbied on behalf of Barbados in the UN system here in Geneva for us to hold it. And it wasn't an easy task. It was very competitive, but in the end we won. And UNCTAD 15 was meant to be in Barbados in October this year, but because of the virus, we had to push it back to next year. But the point I'm making is, we've been able to make impact in that short time because we have that confidence that though we are small, we are no push around. Barbados has a philosophy embedded in it by its first prime minister, where Barbados will be friends of all and satellites of none. That's really our foreign policy. And coming back to UNCTAD as well, because we are hosting UNCTAD and it's a 4-year term, it means that our head of government, Prime Minister Motley, she will be the president of the organization. What does that mean? She will be the singular world leader who will drive the global discussions and agenda on all issues of trade and development. For a small country with no natural resources, no wealth, no military might, I think that's pretty good. But the thing about it is you can't get complacent and say, okay, I've arrived. No, success is not a destination, it's a journey. It's a long, hard slog that you have to continue to undertake. When you look at the best athletes in the world and best sports personalities, best musicians, they've reached incredible heights. But in order for them to be great and continue to be great, they have to keep sharpening their craft. Similarly, countries have to do the same thing. And for us in Barbados, at this point, I can tell you that's what drives us. Yes, we're doing well, we have our challenges, but what's the next frontier that we have to achieve? So that the ordinary man on the street, it's not only about having good international rankings and everything, that's good, and that's part of the architecture. But it really comes down to how does the ordinary man in Bridgetown, or in Oistins, okay, or in Martins Bay, John, wherever, benefit from the international reputation that Barbados have? How is that going to impact my ability to go into the supermarket and buy food and provide for my family? How does that allow me to take our international reputation and be able to afford to send my child to educate to university or to have an affordable education? Yes, in Barbados, tertiary education is free, but there are some who may want to go overseas. So the point is, your quality of life as a nation, and breaking it down to the smallest common denominator, is determined by what your foreign diplomats do abroad to ensure that you have that quality of life through policy and protecting of that space.
Okay, thanks. Well spoken. Now, what is what seems to tick the box with female presidents and prime ministers? Because I've come to realize that when you have a country that has a female prime minister or president, they often do very well. They tick all the boxes. Everything, goes. But you're working with one right now. What does that mean? How does that work?
Well, if I should use her words or paraphrase her, what she said recently on an interview, I think it was with CNN recently, simply is that women care. They have empathy. Now, people may think that men don't. It's not that, but there's a natural built-in mechanism somehow, and I wouldn't know it in the same way because I'm not a woman. But you can see it, you can touch it. There's a natural empathy that women have, that when they bring it to governance, they see things in a way that men historically have not seen. But equally, when you go back to previous years or previous centuries, when queens were in charge of their kingdoms, there was a higher level of empathy to the subjects in historical times. So there has to be a natural inclination. But let's not just look at it from a gender perspective. These women that we're talking about are highly qualified. They're highly intellectual. They've done well in their respective careers prior to coming to public office. And it has therefore allowed for them to hit the ground running in ways that makes you feel very inspired to be citizens of their country. So whether it be Prime Minister Martin of Barbados, whether that be, for example, in Germany with Angela Merkel, in New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern, you can go on. Leadership in women, and that's why, for example, I have a young daughter, and that's why I'm so passionate about it, because I am not one of those males who believe that women's roles are not in governance and politics. No, I would like that if my daughter says to me, Dad, I want to become X or Y, there's no limit. The only limit is what she can conceive to stop her. That has to be the mindset that we give our young women, and that's why I said at the beginning of this interview that I am proud to be a UN gender champion. If you go on the UN Gender Champions website, you will see a number of ambassadors and diplomats across the world, headed by the Secretary General of the UN, who have committed themselves to be champions of gender across the world. It's a very important thing. It's not just a title. It has to be a very lived reality. And it goes back again to what I said before. How does the young girl in Abuja or Lagos or in the Caribbean feel empowered enough to know that they can do anything they want? So, for example, you have in Nigeria, Dangote, the big financial success that he is. But who is the next Dangote in Africa but female? There has to be a mechanism in our societies through our laws and our cultural norms that allows for young girls, women, to feel that they can be empowered to be anything they want to be in life. Will there be challenges? Of course. But we have to help that process. We can't just say, oh, that's not our issue. Absolutely not.
Okay. Thank you for answering this. So, we're going to we're rounding up now. And I just have about 2 more questions for you. Having said all this, what is your aim within the next 2 years?
Well, to continue my job and to continue to represent Barbados at with the best of my ability, to ensure that the interests of every Barbadian is advanced here in Geneva, and to provide opportunities that, again, the ordinary man wants to ensure that they can have, whether that be the ability to trade in a certain environment, whether that be the ability to have their ideas protected under intellectual properties, property law, or through WIPO, for example. That's what drives me, and that's what my next 2 years, I believe, will be, to continuing to advance the interests of Barbados. But not only Barbados. Yes, I'm here as the ambassador of Barbados, but because I'm the chair of a number of global committees, I also serve the world, literally. So for me, it's also about ensuring that the world's interests through the organizations that I chair, well, the committees that I chair, that these interests are also advanced.
Okay, thank you for that. So finally, the issues going on in America. right now. How does the UN get involved in these kind of things? Because even though America is a sovereign state, what sort of policies are in place to look into these kind of issues?
Well, you're right. As you said it best. The United States is a sovereign state. And the institutions, what they do is simply they look at what's happening at any given time, and they look to see any treaties that countries would have signed on to, and look to see what actions are happening and what treaties are there, and then you make a comparison, and then you raise any issues that would be happening at any point in time. So there are mechanisms to ensure that people's interests are protected under the UN. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, His Excellency Charles
My
Blackman.
pleasure.
It was a very, very privileged opportunity to have you on here. Continue with your role and continue representing Barbados in the best way.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.